Pour l'interprétation, le français c'est dans le canal 1, English on channel 2, and Russian channel 3. Bonsoir, bienvenue à cette soirée qui porte un thème sur lequel qui est on ne peut plus actuel, à un moment qui marque un tournant dans les relations internationales et dans la vie démocratique. Il y a 2 ans, qui aurait imaginé que la Russie allait envahir l'Ukraine? Il y a 1 an, qui aurait imaginé que l'Azerbaïdjan allait chasser les Arméniens du Nagorno-Karabakh? Et en septembre, personne n'imaginait qu'il y aurait une nouvelle guerre au Moyen-Orient. En ce qui concerne la démocratie et l'état de droit, personne n'ignore qu'il y a eu une régression au niveau du respect des valeurs et des droits humains, non seulement au niveau mondial, mais aussi au niveau européen, voire au sein même de l'Union européenne. Et donc c'est contre cette toile de fond que l'Association des écoles d'études politiques du Conseil de l'Europe a décidé d'organiser un débat sur l'autoritarisme. Permettez-moi en 2 mots de vous expliquer ce que c'est l'Association des écoles d'études politiques, parce que ça m'étonnerait que beaucoup d'entre vous le sachent. Au Conseil de l'Europe, il y a un projet qui consiste en créer des écoles ce qu'on appelle des écoles d'études politiques, mais qui sont très souvent des ONG qui travaillent dans leurs pays respectifs, et les pays en question, ce sont surtout des pays de l'Europe centrale et orientale. Nous avons 2 écoles aussi en Afrique du Nord, une au Maroc et l'autre en Tunisie, qui font partie de ce réseau des écoles. Et l'association existe pour appuyer les écoles et leur donner une voix, parce que c'est eux qui ont voulu créer l'association. Et il se fait que moi-même et 2 autres personnes, dont notre président, bien entendu, Nils Muznix, nous nous occupons de cette association. Et on essaye toujours, pendant le Forum mondial de la démocratie, d'organiser une réunion publique pour les Strasbourgeois et les Strasbourgeoises, pour que vous puissiez entendre un peu ce qui se passe dans ce domaine tellement complexe et qui crée tellement de problèmes aujourd'hui. Alors, c'est donc les questions qu'on va essayer d'élucider, c'est comment peut-on freiner l'autoritarisme, comment peut-on défaire les perversités commises par des gouvernements autoritaires. La Pologne est un exemple particulier de cela. Comment peut-on détecter à l'avance d'éventuelles dérives autoritaires et les stopper à temps? Mais avant de passer au débat, je voudrais faire une chose qui ne se fait pas normalement, mais je voudrais remercier les gens qui ont rendu possible cette soirée, parce que quand on fait à la fin, tout le monde se lève et part, et on n'entend jamais qui a aidé. Alors, premièrement, je voudrais remercier la ville de Strasbourg, qui nous soutient politiquement et financièrement, et nous leur serons vraiment grés. Merci à l'IRAGE et à sa directrice, NTPBD, je ne sais pas si elle est là ce soir ou pas, mais qui nous accueille chaque année dans cette salle. Merci à la MESA, qui nous a beaucoup aidé cette année, à sa présidente, à Pauline qui est ici, et à d'autres qui sont là, comme monsieur et madame Thierry, je ne les vois plus maintenant, mais qui sont des grands appuis à l'intérieur de la MESA. Merci aux interprètes, parce que sans eux, nous ne comprendrions pas. Et voilà, je voulais remercier tout le monde. Now, if you allow me, I would like to introduce the speakers to you. And I begin on my right with Niels Musnik, who is a political scientist and a human rights expert. His current position is Director for Europe in the Regional Office of Amnesty International. He has been president of our association since 2018. Prior to that, he served as Council of Europe Human Rights Commissioner from 2012 to 2018. He is a Latvian, and he's held some important positions in Latvia. Namely, he was Minister responsible for social integration, anti-discrimination, minority rights, and civil society development. And among other posts he's held, he was Director of the Advanced Social and Political Research Institute and Director of the Latvian Center for Human Rights and Ethnic Studies. I think, is that fair? Yes? Okay, thank you. Now, I turn to an expert, it happens to be in alphabetical order, to Michele Bellini, who is a policy advisor at the Italian Parliament, in the Chamber of Deputies. And from March 2021 to February 2023, he was the Chief of Staff of the leader of the Italian Democratic Party, Enrico Letta. Among other things, he coordinated Agora Democratiche, an innovative project of participatory democracies, which was aimed at building the electoral program through citizen participation. Previously, he's worked as executive officer at Sciences Po Paris, where he focused on European affairs. And during his time in Paris, he contributed to the creation of l'Académie Notre Europe, Institut Jacques Delors, and led the Budapest European Agora. On my left, Frédéric Béraud, who is a Jean Monnet professor and teaches European Union law at Sciences Po Strasbourg and at the Collège de l'Europe in Bruges, where she's a visiting professor and where she teaches internal market law. Not only is she a professor in Strasbourg University, she's also, and that must be quite a responsibility, the vice president of the university in charge of finance. And clearly she's a specialist in EU institutional law and other areas including internal market, competition, border, energy and healthcare law. What else can I say? Yes, she is a member of the Franco-German Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and the International Jean Monnet Frontier in Motion Network, and she's developing research on the relationship between Council of Europe conventions and European law in terms of standards. Then I turn now to, on Niels's right, to Hanna Maszinska. She's a lawyer from Poland and is a social activist who's made significant contributions to the incorporation of European legal standards into Polish law, particularly in the areas of human rights and anti-discrimination legislation. She's also always been involved in the fight against discrimination, xenophobia and intolerance. She's authored numerous publications on human rights. A law graduate, she has a doctorate from Warsaw University, where she is currently a lecturer. For 15 years, she was a colleague because she ran the Warsaw office of the Council of Europe. And during Poland's accession to the European Union, she worked as an expert at the office of the Committee for European Integration. Since then, she's held various government advisory roles towards the government, and she was Deputy Ombudsperson in Poland from 2017 to 2022. She is somebody who is very highly regarded in Poland, and the well-known newspaper culture designated her as Personality of the Year in June of this year. Now, last but not least, is Mikhail Minakov, who's a senior advisor at the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute and a philosopher and a scholar working in the areas of political philosophy, social theory, international development, and the history of modernity. He is also the editor-in-chief of the peer-reviewed journal Ideology and Politics Journal, of the Kennan-focused Ukraine blog, and of the philosophical web portal Koine. Quite a number of things on his plate. He's the author of 6 books, co-author of another 6 books, and numerous articles in philosophy, political analysis, and history. Mikhail has over 20 years of experience in research and teaching in universities in Ukraine, in Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and the United States. So those are our speakers this evening. Now, what we're going to do is to ask each speaker to speak for about 10 minutes, making an introductory statement, and then we will move to give you the opportunity to be able to ask questions or make contributions yourselves. And I'm going to ask Niels, because I think he's probably the person in his job, he has to look at the whole of Europe, and therefore he's probably one of the people who knows best what is going on in Europe in terms of human rights, in terms of democracy, and so on. And so I'd like to give you the floor, Niels.
Thank you, Jack. Good evening, everybody. It's great to be back in this room again. I'm always pleased that there's so much interest in discussing these issues in the general public in Strasbourg. I think it's very odd that we're asking the question, is authoritarianism inevitable at the seat of the Council of Europe? All of the member states of the Council of Europe are supposed to be liberal democracies, and if they're not, then something is wrong. In the Council of Europe region, I would suggest that we only have a few authoritarian regimes. I couldn't say this when I was Commissioner for Human Rights, I can say this now. We only have a few authoritarian regimes, and by that I mean countries where political competition is severely limited, where basic human rights such as freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly are severely restricted. The VDEM project, which is a big democracy research project, very authoritative, calls them electoral autocracies. So you still have elections, but they're not liberal democracies. Poland has been on the list lately, but I will leave Poland to Hanna because she's the expert on Poland. The other ones that are most frequent members of this list in VDEM are Turkey, Azerbaijan, Hungary, and Serbia. Turkey, which has systematically weakened the independence of the judiciary over the last 10 years, where media and NGOs have very little space, and many people are justly imprisoned, including Osman Kavala, one of the founders of the Turkish School of Political Studies. Women and LGBTI rights have been targeted by the government in recent years. The Turkish government did the odd step of withdrawing from a convention with the name of Istanbul on it, the Istanbul Convention. So Turkey's one, Azerbaijan's another. There you could say it has democracy in one family, where the current president inherited the post from his father, and he shares power with his wife. I think there's no other regime in the Council of Europe that has such a setup. All of my former colleagues, or almost all of my former colleagues in the human rights field, are either in exile, in prison, or have been silenced in Azerbaijan. In Hungary, we've had 13 years of kind of the systematic destruction and dismantling of the rule of law, of the independence of the judiciary, media freedom, civic space, LGBTI rights. You might have seen the news now that a museum curator just lost his job because he showed images, he allowed images or photos of LGBTI persons to be shown. This is in a member state of the Council of Europe and also an EU member state. which happens to be Russia's biggest friend in the EU. Serbia, I think, is a country that's very important to watch because they're importing Chinese-style surveillance authoritarianism. They don't need to arrest you at a protest because they have facial recognition cameras and they can pick you up the next day, similar to what happens in Russia. And I would suggest that Serbia's Russia's second biggest friend in the region. More common than authoritarian regimes are right-wing populist parties with an anti-human rights agenda that either share power or are waiting in the wings. Generally, but not always, these are anti-immigrant parties, anti-Muslim parties, anti-LGBTI parties, with a strong anti-women's rights agenda. They also don't like multilateral organizations such as the Council of Europe and the EU. In some countries, they're in coalition governments or propping up governments. Madame Meloni in Italy, the resurgent far right in Greece, Robert Fico and his Smer party in Slovakia, the Finns party in Finland, the Democrats in Sweden. But in others, they're waiting in the wings. Madame Le Pen in France, the FPO in Austria, the AfD in Germany, and others. Now, what drives, so I think we're not only talking about authoritarianism, we're talking about these right-wing populist parties which are driving this anti-rights agenda. I think it's interesting to look at what's driving the success, the electoral success of these parties. And my favorite book explaining the rise of these parties is by Roger Eatwell and Matthew Goodwin, called National Populism, the Revolt Against Liberal Democracy. And they attribute the rise of these right-wing populist parties to four long-term trends. They call them the 4 Ds. You'll see Ds are they're not all exactly Ds, but one is distrust, destruction, deprivation, and de-alignment. Distrust of political parties and institutions that right-wing political parties capitalize on. They say they're all corrupt elites far away from us, they don't understand us, they're not with the people. So right-wing populist parties have capitalized on this distrust. The perceived destruction of national identity and a way of life through migration. So destruction is the D here. It's a bit forced, but so in other words, migration and the strains that this creates in countries. Relative deprivation, the fact that you've had more and more inequality in Eastern Europe, which is not only in Eastern Europe but throughout Europe, which is quite entrenched, which has grown in recent years, not only because of COVID, but because of technological change. I was shocked to read a statistic about the introduction of electric cars in Europe. And you think, oh, we're doing well, we see the Teslas all over the place. Well, it turns out that more than 90% of electric cars in Europe are in the old EU member states, in the EU 14. In other words, electric cars are being introduced, but not in Eastern Europe, or at least not nearly at the same level. So this technological change is also accelerating or deepening inequality. And the fourth is de-alignment, kind of the weakening of the bonds between the traditional parties and their electorates, between social democratic parties and trade unions and so on. And right-wing populist parties have taken advantage of these trends. They're long-term trends. They're here to stay. It doesn't mean that authoritarianism is inevitable, but it does mean that these parties have been introducing a lot of authoritarian practices and narratives, and they're becoming more mainstream. We see this particularly in the case of migration, and there's some political analysts who suggest that migration control and authoritarianism go hand in hand. Why? Because you build fences, you engage in violence at the borders against migrants, you don't punish anybody for engaging in this violence, so you have impunity, which undermines the rule of law. You have the criminalization of solidarity, so in other words, people saving people at sea or providing humanitarian assistance are accused of facilitating irregular migration and punished, and this is taking place in many countries in Europe. You have more and more surveillance being used, not only against migrants and refugees, but against those trying to help them. And you have growing attempts to subvert European and international standards. Last year, for the first time, I think we had 12 member states of the EU calling for a revision of asylum law within the EU. That's the first time we've had so many. Usually it was a couple of countries, Denmark, maybe Austria, but now it's 12 or 13 countries. But also, hand in hand with this goes a justification of cooperation with authoritarian regimes all along Europe's external borders. In other words, outsourcing the dirty work. This means cutting deals with Turkey, cutting deals with Morocco, cutting deals with Tunisia, cutting deals with Rwanda, to take care of Europe's dirty work. Another trend, I think, which at Amnesty we're quite concerned about right now, is restrictions on the right to protest. Amnesty has a huge global campaign called Protect the Protest, which has been going on for about a year. And it's becoming more and more topical in Europe because we see blanket bans on protests, we see various kinds of restrictions, we see slap suits, we see very nasty narratives about protesters. And the two key targets in the last year or two, first are climate protesters, which are accused of being terrorists, of disrupting things, and you have more and more draconian laws being passed to try to prevent civil disobedience by climate protesters. And the other is more recent. It's people expressing solidarity with Palestinians. Where in many countries you have blanket bans on protests in solidarity with Palestine. And the same kind of narratives you had 20 years ago after 9/11 come up, basically equating all Palestinians with Hamas, or Hamas with ISIS, and all Muslims with terrorists, and so on. Quite a scary narrative turn, and we see it also in legislation, where not only are we talking about, usually with regard to the right to protest, we talk about public order as being the justification for restrictions. But now countries are more and more invoking national security, which means they are claiming a much larger degree of a margin of appreciation to restrict rights and freedoms and to go after people. And this is quite scary. Both these groups, climate protesters and anybody protesting in favor of Palestinian rights, are being speared as extremists or even terrorists. So it's quite a scary development that we're seeing now. Now this process of kind of right-wing populist victories and more and more influence is not unidirectional. We see some exceptions, some hopeful signs. In Slovenia, in 2022, the opposition succeeded in beating the right-wing populist government, led by Janez Janša, who had systematically undermined media freedom, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression. There, for example, one of the measures they used, you had protests for months after month after month against the government there, and they began to slap huge fines on protesters, making them pay for the policing of the protests. So there's one theater director who was slapped with a 40,000 euro fine to pay for the policing of the protests. So this isn't an EU Council of Europe country, which I find quite striking. It was all changed since the elections. In Spain, I think the election result surprised a lot of people. Everybody was expecting Vox to do well, and they did very poorly. We don't have a government yet in Spain, but I think it was quite interesting that Vox underperformed in many realms. And just last month, of course, the Polish opposition beat the right-wing populists of Law and Justice in the election. Undoing the legacy of many years of the Law and Justice Party and its dismantling of democracy will be very, very difficult. Hanna will talk more about that. The president will obstruct the Constitutional Court is still there. Other courts are packed, but the Polish democratic forces need our full support. Adding to the challenge of these negative trends is the fact that the international context is less and less friendly to democracy. My own organization, Amnesty, is a big NGO. So if we're in trouble, you can imagine that smaller NGOs are in much bigger trouble. And what has happened to Amnesty over the last few years? We were kicked out of India, kicked out of China, Hong Kong, and kicked out of Russia. So India, China, and Russia, that's a pretty big piece of real estate in the world. And if Amnesty can't work in these countries, you can imagine how smaller NGOs are faring. So not only do we have these negative trends in these very large countries, but we have the US elections coming 1 year away, and the Republican Party, I would submit, is very much an authoritarian right-wing populist party. They just elected a speaker who espouses Trump's big lie. So the authoritarian practices and narratives are becoming more common. We have to fight against them, especially in migration. I think it's quite scary that even in Poland, the liberal opposition played the anti-migrant card. I think this is probably a sign of things to come. We must demonstrate to the wider public how repressive migration policy affects the majority, how it affects the fabric of democracy, not only how it affects negatively the rights of migrants and refugees. We must learn from the successes in defeating authoritarians. We must learn how to create a new template for helping countries rebuild liberal democracy after authoritarianism, and to do so in a way that is compatible with human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. I will stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Nils. Je voudrais juste rajouter une chose. Nils a parlé de ce que j'appellerais une macro-ONG, Amnesty International. L'association des écoles d'études politiques est probablement une micro-ONG, mais nous avons bien souffert des populistes autoritaires, parce que premièrement, l'école de Moscou, dès 2012 et les premières lois introduites par Poutine, cette organisation, cette école a souffert et maintenant ne peut plus fonctionner en Russie. Elle est située en dehors et organise ses travaux en dehors avec la diaspora. L'Azerbaïdjan, dont parlait aussi Nils, un monsieur qui s'appelle Ilgar Mammadov, pour ceux qui connaissent un peu les droits de l'homme, sauront qu'il y a eu une affaire Mammadov devant la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme, et ce monsieur a quand même fait 5 ans et demi de prison pour des raisons totalement factices avant d'être libéré. Et actuellement, on a parlé de Osman Kavala en Turquie, qui reste en prison, condamné à perpétuité, ce qui est vraiment une honte pour ce pays. Alors, ça c'était juste pour vous donner une idée comment une petite instance peut souffrir. Et d'ailleurs, nous avons été déclarés organisation indésirable par le procureur général de la Russie. Et on fait appel à travers toutes les instances russes, bien entendu on a toujours perdu. Maintenant, c'est la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme qui traite de cette affaire avec un certain nombre d'autres affaires concernant des ONG qui ont souffert une news. Alors, Hannah, I'd like to turn to you if I may. I think Niels has already said it, but I think it would be very interesting if you could tell us how you managed to get rid of this government of yours, or not your government, but the Polish government. How do you feel you're going to be able to reverse all the damage which has been done by the PSI, particularly in the sort of judicial field, and, for instance, in the field of abortion, which is one of the very sensitive issues, I think, which people are aware of in Poland.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm so happy that I can share a very positive message with you, very positive reflection about Poland. But let me say that my story is not a fairy tale. You will be surprised that in the middle of the European Union, Poland became a country, we call it within a country fundamentally destroying human rights, rule of law and democracy. Well, the last 8 years in Poland, the ruling of the law and justice, very right-wing party. It was from the political, social point of view, it was a disaster for us. It was, I think Poland could be a very good laboratory nowadays for not only populist, but definitely for very progressive organizations. We wanted to show you how to avoid this tendency. First of all, let me say that in 2021, they said, the experts said, Poland has moved further towards autocracy than any other country in the world over the last decade. Poland has fallen to 63rd place. That put us above Ecuador, the Solomon Island, Botswana, but below Bulgaria, Lesotho, Mongolia. This is Poland falls to lowest ever position in World Press Freedom Index. This is 2021 and 2023, the situation before the election we found even worse. They started, the law and justice started to destroy, first of all, the constitutional organs, constitutional tribunal, the Supreme Court, and then common courts. The new legal system, which allows president to nominate people with the wrong procedure, contrary to the constitutional principle. One of our colleagues, Professor Wyrzykowski, who is a former member of the Constitutional, the judge of the Constitutional Court, said that we lost sovereignty because we intentionally decided to violate Polish constitution. And that's right. The constitution was just a decoration, but not a real act. But at the same time, constitution for the non-governmental organization, for the civic society, it was a flagship. And flagship which allowed us to overcome this political barbarism. And I belong to a very nice social movement, Tour de Konstytucja. So we are traveling in Poland everywhere, to big cities and small cities, and we talk to people in the street about the constitution. This is a street education. And also we try to enter schools, which is not very easy. But first of all, after destroying these very important organs, the next target it was we had judges and intimidation, horrible intimidation of judges. so disciplinary measures against them, very severe measures. Probably you know that the special representative, a United Nations special representative for judiciary and human rights, and there is a report, and he said that it is such a massive scale of destroying the situation in Poland in judiciary is unacceptable. Fortunately, we are with this problem, we are not alone. The Secretary General was quite clear, saying that this type of violation of European Convention on Human Rights is absolutely not acceptable. I tell you that the Constitutional Tribunal decided that, adopted a judgment saying that Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights, dealing with the fair trial, will not be implemented in Poland in the cases concerning judges and concerning rule of law. So it is, a scandal. It is something what it's after 30 years of our membership in the Council of Europe, we learned that finally the European Convention, with this very important provision, is has nothing to do with the Polish judiciary. But it is very important that we have judges, hero judges, leading figures, and they decided to fight in favor of the rule of law, human rights and democracy. The price was very high. It was a massive disciplinary procedure against them. The government cut their salaries. The intimidation, they reached even on a personal basis the families of judges. The same with prosecutors. So the situation was really tragic. But there were not only this group of society, let's say, victims of these changes, because we have also just civic society, very brave, and it is, for me, it is always an optimism. Civic society, people, young people, old people, who decided, no, we cannot tolerate this situation. Every changes in law, every hostile, let's say, takeover of the institution created a massive protest, street protest, arrest, and it was sometimes I'm sitting in front of Alexander, and believe me, Alexander, that some scenes from the street we can compare to Belarus. It was the oppression against people in the street was incredible. In the Ombudsman office, my area of interest and activity was the places of detention. Not only places of detention, but it was migration issues and the eastern, the border with Belarus and migration. So the most tricky problems. And it was a horror, absolutely horror. And impunity, it was another. Well, they have police and border guard, they have a political umbrella. And they know that they go very far, and they can use all possible methods. We had in the office, I was involved in a tragic situation of 30 people died after the intervention of the police. So again, in the middle of the European Union. But there is a very visible protest, not only protest of the opposition. It was extremely important. You mentioned, Niels, the migration issues. Migrants was the next group, the enemy. So the propaganda, the propaganda against migrants was incredible. I should add that in Poland we have a private media, but also so-called public media, totally destroyed by the ruling party, public media. So many people, well, they could watch television, public television, with the fake news, with everything, what was really incredible. So it was a schizophrenic picture of Poland. Private television showing a real situation and public television totally wrong presentations. So I give you an example. Tomorrow I'll be in Brussels. In Brussels we will have in the European Parliament a presentation of a very famous film by Agnieszka Holland, very international, very popular director. The title of the film is The Green Border. It is about the situation at the border with Belarus. And it was such an attack addressed against her. The President of Poland compared her to Nazi propagandist. It was a dangerous situation, physically dangerous situation. So finally the authority and people around her offered her a guard, 24 hours guard. And Agnieszka Holland received a title, Doctorate Honoris Causa, and she couldn't attend this ceremony. It was an empty place. She was afraid to come. But the film is, I spent quite many days, many months at the border. So the film was, very universal, let's say, film addressed to international audience. She received an award in Venice. She received also in Vatican, because it was absolutely great artistic film based on facts. And this is a story. This is a story also about the cultural life. The ruling party totally destroyed. They removed directors of the museum, directors of culture institutions, and then education. Again, there is a fear expressed by teachers. We are afraid because there is such a pressure coming from the top on the profile, educational profile. So talking and education about sexual life, my goodness, forbidden. Imagine in 21st century. And you mentioned also abortion. Abortion, it was a very important moment when the so-called Constitutional Tribunal decided, adopted a judgment, a total ban on abortion. And then, as a result, thousands of people decided to protest. So, I cannot find one type of activity which I would say, okay, it was a very positive picture. Definitely not. And let me say at the end about the election, because there is a book on tyranny, 20 lessons from the 20th century. Timothy Snyder, a very famous historian from the Yale University. And he, these 20 lessons are very important. Do not obey in advance. Defend institutions. take responsibility for the face of the world, reflect if you must be armed, stand out, and so on and so on. This is absolutely, this is like a Bible. And then what happened in Poland at the end? Finally, 15th of October, and the election in Poland. Believe me, that many people compare this election to 1989. So 1989, the transformation from communist to democracy and so on. I was sick on 15th of October because for me, for my generation, it is the election to be or not to be. It was, we've been in a panic. And finally what happened? A great turnout, more than 74% of turnout. Young people, women, and it was something what I call their revolution. They said, well, we have to stop this authority. They cannot destroy Poland anymore. And so finally, the opposition received 200, the coalition received 248 seats in the parliament and 198 for the ruling party. In the Senate, the second chamber, 66 for the opposition, 39 for the ruling party. So it is a victory. Why? Because of strong civil society, because of strong voice of people, private media, a huge campaign, all people, actors, writers decided to be active. And then two safeguards. Our safeguards are Europe, believe me. The Council of Europe with a strong voice, for instance, Dunia Mijatovic, the Commissioner for Human Rights, and all the Venice Commission, ECRI, many organs, and also Secretary General, and first of all, the European Court of Human Rights. Imagine that in the European Court of Human Rights, there are hundreds of pending cases concerning only judiciary, hundreds. So it is absolutely, for the Court of Human Rights, it is a disaster, but it was, it is really absolutely fascinating how the European Court reacted to this issue of the rule of law and judiciary. And, of course, the European Union and the Court of Justice in the European Union. Many judgments saying, like in Strasbourg, that what you are doing with this constitutional organs is absolutely, it's contrary to the European standards. And now the new government. Well, yesterday the president decided that he will ask, and he decided to nominate the old prime minister to form a government, which is, well, I think, why, but they wanted to do everything what is possible to destroy papers, to, well, I didn't mention a corruption, a huge corruption in Poland. But at the end, the second stage, it will be definitely Donald Tusk, who will be a prime minister, and he's ready with it. Yes, I'm ready as well. So this is finally, this is a positive story, and I'm so proud that we have such a strong civil society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for a very moving and interesting statement and description of what's going on in your country. The only reason I stopped you is because of clocks going round, and we've got other speakers to come in libéraux. Parce que demain, vous savez peut-être, à Bruxelles, la Commission va annoncer, va publier son rapport sur l'élargissement de l'Union européenne vers l'Ukraine et vers les pays des Balkans de l'Ouest. Alors, je voulais vous poser une question. Est-ce que vous pensez que l'élargissement de l'Union européenne, c'est vraiment la bonne façon de consolider la démocratie et les droits humains en Europe? Est-ce que l'Union européenne deviendrait un rempart contre les dérives autoritaires? Il y a une deuxième question, je vais quand même limiter dans le temps, mais tous les sondages sont en train d'indiquer que lors des prochaines élections européennes, on risque d'avoir peut-être aux deux extrêmes, mais surtout un mouvement vers la droite et qui va peut-être changer l'équilibre classique qu'il y a eu à l'intérieur du Parlement européen. Et je voulais savoir ce que vous pensiez que ça pourrait avoir comme effet sur l'avenir de l'Union européenne.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais essayer de répondre le plus rapidement possible, avec des arguments qui tiennent à la discipline, qui sont des arguments juridiques, mais en prenant la précaution de dire que le droit ne peut pas tout, et que les réponses que j'essaierai d'esquisser sont des réponses qui sont contingentes, et qui nécessairement seront partielles. Et ça, je pense que c'est peut-être important de le rappeler. Pourquoi? Parce que l'Union européenne a beaucoup basé son influence et sa construction sur le droit, comme rempart à la guerre, et puis un droit qui avait pour objectif de discipliner les États. Et d'un certain point de vue, elle y réussit plutôt bien, si l'on considère effectivement qu'il n'y a pas eu de guerre depuis fort longtemps entre les États qui sont les États de l'Union européenne, et qu'il discipline effectivement les États sur tout un tas de politiques, en imposant effectivement le respect des valeurs de l'Union européenne. Alors, on vient de voir combien cette influence est importante en Pologne. Cette influence, elle s'opère d'abord au moment du processus d'adhésion. Et l'adhésion suppose le respect d'un certain nombre de critères, dont la démocratie et dont le respect des droits, mais aussi de l'état de droit. Et je pense que quand on écoute ce qui vient d'être dit, on mesure l'importance de cet état de droit et combien cette valeur de l'Union européenne est frontalement remise en cause dans le monde qui est le monde d'aujourd'hui. L'adhésion, c'est donc une espèce de moment idéal pour discuter du respect d'un certain nombre de conditions qui sont nécessaires à l'état de droit, et de discuter finalement de la capacité de l'État qui souhaite entrer dans l'Union européenne à respecter ses valeurs. C'est en cela que la journée de demain, effectivement, va être déterminante du point de vue politique, puisqu'elle va dresser un premier état des lieux, et que dans les chapitres qui sont ensuite négociés pas à pas durant l'adhésion, évidemment, cette condition de respect des valeurs de l'Union européenne va permettre l'ouverture des négociations, et puis peut, on le sait aussi, ralentir considérablement les négociations, comme ça a été le cas avec la Bulgarie et la Roumanie, qui ont attendu 3 ans de plus pour pouvoir entrer dans l'Union européenne, entre autres, pour donner un certain nombre de garanties concernant la lutte contre la corruption. Donc on voit bien que du point de vue juridique et politique, l'adhésion peut être un bon moment pour exporter finalement la vision qui est celle de l'Union européenne et pour construire, et ça je pense que c'est peut-être important de le rappeler, que la construction de cette Union européenne, je crois que je préférerais le terme d'avant qui était communauté européenne, parce que cette communauté, elle est fondée sur le respect d'un certain nombre de valeurs. Et du coup, l'adhésion est un moyen, effectivement, d'entrer dans ce cercle, mais aux conditions qui sont celles de l'Union européenne. Alors, évidemment, ça pose plein de problèmes, hein, de savoir quand on regarde ces conditions, on sait que c'est mené à des tensions importantes entre l'Union européenne et l'Albanie, par exemple, récemment. Comment est-ce qu'on va regarder le respect de ces valeurs et que, évidemment, quand on regarde comment est-ce que la démocratie est respectée, comment les droits sont respectés, il se pose la question du standard qu'on va utiliser pour regarder effectivement ce respect. Donc, les procédures probablement sont critiquables, je pense extrêmement importantes par rapport à la manière dont l'état de droit, ou globalement le respect des droits est aujourd'hui remis en cause. La procédure d'adhésion reste certainement un moment tout à fait fondateur, à la fois pour l'Union européenne et pour l'État entrant. Ça n'empêche pas, et c'est ce que petit à petit l'Union européenne a dû adapter, ça n'empêche pas qu'après l'adhésion, un État, et on l'a bien vu avec l'exemple de la Pologne qui vient d'être donné, avec les exemples qu'on connaît aussi en Hongrie, qu'on connaît en République tchèque, qu'on connaît dans un certain nombre d'États, la démocratie peut devenir ce qui, quelque part, est un paradoxe, une démocratie illibérale, et peut-être revendiquée comme telle. Et puis, les États peuvent, par différents moyens, et on l'a bien vu aussi, sous l'influence de la pandémie, sous l'influence du bouleversement géopolitique auquel est soumis le monde, et qui fait que ce qu'on dit ce soir ne sera peut-être plus vrai demain, et cette accélération assez considérable des déséquilibres font que les États de l'Union européenne peuvent aussi, alors même qu'ils ont été contrôlés à l'entrée de l'Union européenne, connaître des problèmes par rapport à l'état de droit ou au respect des valeurs. Et là, le droit a tenté de s'adapter. Je rappelle que dans l'Union européenne n'existe pas ce qui existe dans le Conseil de l'Europe, qui est une procédure d'expulsion d'un État quand il ne respecte plus les lois, quand il ne respecte plus les valeurs fondamentales. C'est ce qu'a fait effectivement le Conseil de l'Europe contre la Russie. On en mesure aussi toutes les difficultés. Les difficultés à la fois politiques, les difficultés qui sont aussi les difficultés du Conseil de l'Europe depuis cette expulsion. Ça n'existe pas dans l'Union européenne. Dans l'Union européenne, on défend beaucoup ce que certains auteurs appellent la mythologie de la table, c'est-à-dire que tout le monde reste autour de la table une fois qu'on est rentré, sauf ceux qui veulent en sortir. Et le Brexit est un très bon exemple de ce que suppose la sortie de l'Union européenne et des difficultés qu'affronte effectivement à la fois le Royaume-Uni et dans une certaine mesure, moindre il est vrai, mais une certaine mesure tout de même, l'Union européenne. Les mécanismes juridiques qu'on a essayé d'inventer pour contraindre l'État, c'est évidemment la pression des juges. Et vous l'avez très bien dit pour la Pologne, la pression à la fois des juges nationaux qui suppose de protéger le système national et en particulier l'indépendance du juge, l'importance des organes judiciaires comme la Cour de justice de l'Union européenne, l'importance aussi dans l'Union européenne de la Commission européenne, puisque c'est elle qui a initié plusieurs procédures de manquement, par exemple contre la Pologne ou contre la Hongrie, qui ont mené à des arrêts qui sont absolument fondamentaux à lire pour comprendre quel est le modèle européen de la démocratie, de l'état de droit, de l'indépendance des juges, bref, de toutes ces choses qui sont aujourd'hui très facilement remises en cause, mais qui étant très facilement remises en cause mettent en danger les principes mêmes, les fondements mêmes de la démocratie. Après, les juges ne sont que les juges, c'est-à-dire qu'ils vont juger d'abord en fonction des instruments qu'ils ont et de l'autorité qu'ils ont. Et on sait qu'aujourd'hui, l'une des questions, et qui est directement posée d'ailleurs par la Pologne, par la Cour constitutionnelle polonaise, voire par le gouvernement polonais, en tout cas avant les élections, c'était de savoir jusqu'à quel point est-ce qu'on respecte les décisions qui sont celles de la Cour de justice de l'Union européenne. À ce jour, le jeu a toujours fonctionné, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a toujours eu un respect de ce que décidait la Cour de justice de l'Union européenne, même si on a connu des tensions avec les cours constitutionnelles françaises, italiennes, allemandes, etc., mais ça restait de l'ordre de la tension. Évidemment, le problème qui va se poser, c'est qu'est-ce qu'on fait le jour où un État membre ne respecte pas ce que dit la Cour de justice de l'Union européenne. Cette question-là, on se la pose aussi par rapport à ce qu'un État peut faire dans l'Union européenne. On a des procédures qui peuvent aller jusqu'à la suspension des droits. On a ce qu'on va appeler le cadre d'état de droit, et peut-être que la démultiplication des procédures inventées est peut-être un mauvais signe, parce que dans une certaine mesure, elle montre qu'aucune de ces procédures n'est véritablement efficace. Néanmoins, elle permet des contacts, par exemple, le cadre d'état de droit permet des contacts étroits entre l'Union européenne et le Conseil de l'Europe, en utilisant du coup des mécanismes qui ne sont pas les mêmes, mais qui, combinés, peuvent avoir un effet de persuasion de l'État. L'autre phénomène qu'on a vu apparaître et qui, à certains égards, rappelle des débats qu'on a eus pour la politique extérieure et notre capacité à pouvoir exporter nos standards démocratiques dans la politique extérieure, c'est la question de la conditionnalité. Et la conditionnalité, qui peut être une conditionnalité politique, s'est transformée sous l'influence de la Covid dans l'Union européenne. C'est-à-dire que pour avoir accès au fonds du Next Generation EU, donc le grand fonds qui a été mis en place de manière d'ailleurs totalement inattendue par l'Union européenne, eh bien la condition de l'état de droit est une condition de versement des fonds. Donald Tusk, par exemple, a déjà fait un voyage à Bruxelles pour donner un certain nombre de garanties, alors même que le nouveau gouvernement n'est pas formé, et demander le déblocage des fonds. Et on sait que cette pression-là, qui est une pression budgétaire, a eu aussi un certain nombre de conséquences sur la situation de la Hongrie, particulièrement complexe, on l'a rappelé tout à l'heure, parce que la Hongrie était également la meilleure amie de la Russie. Alors ça montre, ces quelques exemples, que l'adhésion est certainement pas, le contrôle de l'adhésion n'est certainement pas suffisant, et qu'il faut combiner les pressions pour que l'État, finalement, continue de respecter les standards européens. Alors ça va me permettre de terminer en répondant à votre deuxième question. Évidemment, le problème de ce raisonnement-là, c'est que, on le voit bien, les juges ont une certaine influence, mais qu'il faut d'autre part combiner avec l'influence des institutions. J'évoquais tout à l'heure la Commission européenne, il est évident que le Parlement européen a également un rôle tout à fait déterminant à jouer. C'est d'autant plus vrai que le Parlement européen a aujourd'hui dans l'Union européenne des pouvoirs qui sont à l'égal des pouvoirs des États. Ce constat-là, effectivement, fait craindre finalement le poids du Parlement européen si le Parlement européen devenait un Parlement d'extrême droite, où l'extrême droite en tout cas est un poids plus important. Et je ne peux que que faire ce constat, effectivement, ou d'exprimer en tout cas cette crainte, ce qui fait certainement des prochaines élections au Parlement européen, des élections tout à fait déterminantes, montrant certainement que la démocratie, l'état de droit, la manière dont on revendique la sécurité dans les États européens suppose un système juridique qui soit le plus complet possible, suppose des pressions budgétaires qui soient les plus efficaces possibles, mais suppose aussi, et c'est un défi auquel très certainement nous sommes confrontés, moi particulièrement en tant qu'universitaire, suppose une éducation permanente à la démocratie, et c'est sur ces quelques éléments que je terminerai.
Merci beaucoup Frédéric. Je tire une conclusion de ce que vous avez dit et ce qu'a dit Hannah tout à l'heure, c'est que c'est l'engagement de chaque individu, que ce soit individuellement ou que ce soit dans des ONG ou que ce soit dans d'autres domaines, qui fait que les choses peuvent changer et qu'on peut protéger la démocratie. Je crois vraiment qu'il faut que chacun assume ses responsabilités pour protéger nos valeurs et protéger la démocratie dans nos pays. Alors, I'm going to move on now to, I think, with Michele, and I've got a very simple question for you, if that will. I mean, I think it's a simple question. I don't know if the answer is simple, but just tell us what it's like in Italy 1 year on from having a far-right government run by Mrs. Meloni.
Thank you, Jack, and thanks to the Association of Schools of Political Studies for the invitation, and thank you for being here, even though it's starting to become late. To answer your question, what I will try to do is I will try to give you some references to the situation in Italy, also to try and answer the overarching question of this panel, which I think it's a very good question. So the first element that I give you, and I think it's very important to understand the context, it's what I call the democratic promise. When we talk about democracy, I usually try to refer to polls to understand also a bit of the data of the public opinion. And right now in Italy, 52% of the people believe that democracy doesn't work and that we should actively looking for another system of governance. It gets more interesting, of course, if you look at more closely at the data, and it will not surprise you, it's mostly the losers of globalization, it's the people for whom the social elevator is broken that are the most dissatisfied with democracy. So 52% is the average. It gets to 65% for housewives, 61% for blue-collar workers, and the single only category where it's more than 50%, precisely 56% believing that democracy is better and democracy works, surprise, it's more affluent people. So the first element is that a partial explanation of the democratic fatigue we are seeing, and also in Italy as well, is the difficulty for democracy to deliver on its promise of economic emancipation and prosperity. And this brings me to another important keyword that describes what we are seeing in Italy, and it's the word expectations. Italy is the only country in the OECD where in the last 30 years the incumbent majority, governing majority, has been defeated in elections. And this is why in the recent Italian history, basically what we have been witnessing is cycles of deep infatuations followed by disenchantment. So we had in 2014 Renzi with Partito Democratico, then this moved to the five-star movement, then it moved to the Lega of Matteo Salvini, and now Meloni. In a way, you can also see last year's election in this sense. She was basically the last one to try. No? We've tried everybody. Everybody basically was a delusion, was a dissatisfaction. So we tried the perceived new actor. And she was more than 10 years in opposition, and she was not new, but she used this 10 years in opposition to basically regain her credibility. And a collateral aspect of this cycle is that, yes, you try different parties and different leaders, but at every round of the wheel, some people don't go and don't vote. So you see how this cycle of infatuation and disenchantment is based on expectations that are not met systematically. And I say this because maybe the Italian example is an extreme case of something that I believe is an inherent feature of democracy, that it's systematically it's systematically in a constant state of crisis because it raises more expectations than what it is actually able to satisfy. This is a structural thing, and I think we need to be very conscious of this fact. I mean, Tocqueville in his works already said, no, that desires grow much faster than fortunes. And so obviously you see that how can you meet expectations if our societies are not going towards more equality, but they are going towards more inequalities. So there is this inevitable gap between expectations and the capacity of democracy to satisfy them. And what I think is the most important point is that the more this gap grows, the more the authoritarian temptation becomes stronger. And here is basically it's a logic error, right? Because what we tend to do, and I think in Italy we are seeing this, and it explains that 52% of thinking democracy is bad, is that we tend to identify the struggles of our times with democracy. No? This is the logical mistake. So people think, oh, because authoritarianism is the opposite of democracy, maybe authoritarianism will give us better results than democracy. Then we know that the problem is that authoritarianism, in addition to the bad results of democracy, gives us a bunch more of problems. So I want to tell you now a bit some of the factors that can influence the amplification of this gap of expectations. Well, first I already hinted at it, it's the economic aspects. If in our society we are in constant economic crisis, the pie shrinks and you never get out of this expectations paradox. Just to give you a fact about Italy, it's the only European country where from 1990 to 2020, real wages have decreased 2.9%. All of the other European countries have actually increased in these 30 years. And the second aspect that obviously influences this gap of expectations in democracy is the increasing individualism and materialism of society. I mean, it's no surprise we come from decades where the mantra was what Margaret Thatcher said, no? That society doesn't exist, you only have individual man and individual woman. And neoliberalism has played a part in this, and in general, this thinking that we should focus on the multiplication of means, but ends are just in a subjective way. And so you see that if we are constantly in struggle in identifying ourselves as a community, I like Frederic, your reference to the community, because this is the key word that we are lacking. And if it's more difficult to identify ourselves as a community, no wonder why polarization increases. And an aspect of increasing polarization is that we become more dogmatic, in our beliefs. our beliefs coincide with our identities, and so how can we change our beliefs if our beliefs match with our identities? But democracy is based on the fact that there are no absolute truths. No, that's the essence of democracy. While on the other hand, authoritarianism is based on the idea that there are absolute truths. And so you have another paradox. The world is so uncertain, we live in so uncertain times that maybe authoritarian regimes with their false certainties, they give you a bit of, a bit more security. But we know that it's an illusion. And of course, facing uncertainty of today's world requires courage and responsibility. I always think about a sentence that Romano Guardini said in a speech when he was remembering the kids of the White Rose, that this resistance movement that tried to fight the Nazi regime. And I think when he was remembering these kids, he said something that I think is very true, that the totalitarian temptation is dangerous because it offers people to free them from their own responsibilities. And I read you the quote from his speech because I think it's literally enlightening. And he says, totalitarianism takes away from the individual the burden of having to think for himself, of having to judge, to decide, to answer for his own destiny. This is the great temptation. What took place in 1933 and continued for 12 whole years with consequences in the end that seem utterly apocalyptic was not only accomplished from the top down, but also from the bottom up. Another amplifier of the gap between expectations is time. We know that the time of democracy and the time of society are, increasingly misaligned. Democracy takes time because it's about deliberation and discussion, but this means that nevertheless we have to be open to the idea of reforming our institutions and our democracies, not to sacrifice time, but at least to make them more in line with the times we are living into. In Italy we have a system, a parliamentary system, which is called the perfect bicameralism. It means that the Senate and the Chamber, they have the same tasks, the same powers. And this was a system set up after the fascism in order to limit the power of the government. But since we have failed many times in reforming this system, what is happening now? That de facto the system has changed in any way, in any case, but instead of changing it in an orderly way, in practice, the constitution remains the same, but in practice we do something else. I give you a very specific example. Also, every year the budget law, which is arguably the best, the most important core of a government, the budget law, constitutionally you should send it to both, arms of the branches of parliament. Now it's become a praxis that you just send it 1 year to the Senate, the other year to the Chamber. Well, this year the government went even further because they asked their own governing majorities not to put forward amendments. But that's another story, and I don't want to get too political. Approaching the end, other aspects that I think we are facing, not just in Italy, but this in general in Europe and in liberal democracies. And I think this is an aspect crucial to the relationship between democracy and authoritarianism, is the twin transition, decarbonization and the digital revolution. Decarbonization, we just talked about the time factor. We are all witnessing that decarbonizing in 25 years, as we should do, or decarbonizing in 100 years, it's like, it changes, no? And for a democracy, there is the challenge that needs to be done. This whole deep and quick change, which probably a change we've never had to face in the history of mankind. We need to do it fast and in a democracy, possibly with the support of the people, right? So one could provocatively say that a dictatorship can be much more efficient in decarbonizing the economy. If the dictator decides that it's it's the right direction to take, it's going to be much easier. So you see how this challenge, which is again one of the most important challenges our societies, our economies are facing, literally, calls into question the individual freedom, which is a pillar of our modern political thought. And so democracy is faced with this challenge of balancing the fact that you need to do this change very fast, and it's a very big change, and on the other hand, you need to do it in a way that is acceptable for people. The other revolution, the digital revolution, well, we know that it's all about artificial intelligence, the control of data, and right now whoever controls the data really, together with the ability of processing information, really has a form of power. The historian Harari argued in a book that in the second half of the 20th century, technologies, the state of technologies made it inefficient to centralize power and information. And this gave an advantage to democracies over authoritarian regimes for their better ability to process information. What we are witnessing right now with the AI revolution and the digital revolution is that this may change, no? Now we see, as I was saying before, with big tech and everything, we see that data are centralized and they are processed in a non-transparent way. So it's not obvious that competitive advantage that Harari referred to in his book will remain in such a big technological revolution. And another thing about digitalization is that it's pushed a lot by this by private interest, by economic interest. So here you see another misalignment. With the digital revolution, it's all about optimizing the process, but we know that democracy is something else. Democracy is about collectively deciding our future together. So the challenge there for democracy is how do you also turn these opportunities towards democratic empowerment. So what I try to give you, also referring to some examples from Italy, are some elements to analyze the question. That it's a very important question, and I hope I repeat to the organization, really good title. I don't believe that there's anything inevitable in life, but for sure, this expectations gap, we need to work to make sure that in our societies it doesn't widen, because otherwise the answer is not an obvious answer that authoritarianism is not inevitable. As I said, I think nothing is inevitable, and I think it depends on the ability that we will put into sort of healing our democracies and also reforming them to make sure that this gap doesn't get too wide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michele. I was interested in the concept of time, because you spoke about time of democracy to time of politics, but the politicians' time is even shorter, because they have to react within seconds or minutes. But it was a very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. I'd now like to turn to Michael, and I've got a first question to you, which is, do you think that, well, you know that Charles Michel has said that the horizon for enlargement the European Union is 2030, which is in a little over 6 years' time. Do and social field, for instance, by 2030? That's one question. And the other question, which is slightly different, but I wanted to know from you how you think that people in Ukraine reacting to the idea of a possible second Trump administration in the United States.
Well, these are all provocative questions. Well, I see tired eyes of our audience. It was a long day, long panel. I'll try to provoke you with several issues. First of all, because I disagree with most of what was said before. Elections in recent 10 to 15 years do not produce democratic outcome, or let's say less and less so. Europeanization does not necessarily produce democratic outcome in Eastern Europe and Northern Eurasia. Even civil society, active civil society, does not necessarily bring democracy back in their states. And here, in this context, I will answer to your questions then. So first of all, the future of Ukraine in 6 years, in 2 years, tomorrow, depends on war. Militarization of our region, war in Ukraine, it's this event of events that preconditions everything. So the first factor, what will happen with the war, when it ends, and on which conditions, and with which perspective. Is it frozen conflict? Is it victory of Ukraine? Is it victory of Europe, West, or failure? So it's everything that is connected with European membership, with membership in the European Union for Ukraine, depends on this war. And second, yes, it's internal issues. How do Ukrainian power elites and how Ukrainian citizenry will look at the West and at European Union in this near future, depending on the results of the war. So here, that's basically the answer, or avoiding the answer, realistic answer to your questions, because everything depends on these two issues. Well, Ian Kohut, who is here, and he just brought us a very interesting report, how Ukrainian parliament was working during the war. It's very good, empirically based, and boring document. Boring because democracy, especially liberal democracy, is hugely boring. And you know when, sorry Jack, I will invite another guest to sit here, Thomas Hobbes, in spirit. When he sit here, he would bring us something very provocative. So if you have rational politics, which is boring, like parliament, well, it's about Leviathan. Emotional politics, revolutions, uprisals, and so on, it's Behemoth, another book. And Leviathan was praised and published during his lifetime. Behemoth was a prohibited book. And it's like two poles of different politics, emotional and very rational. And of course, what we saw for a very long time, between 70s and early 21st century, it was the third wave of democracy, or democratization. So that more and more countries, peoples, were entering into political systems, political regimes connected to democracy. However, in recent 10 to 15 years, we live in the third wave of autocratization. Last year, in the same panel, there was a gentleman, this year, who was provoking us and saying, oh, you guys telling us about crisis of democracy, and you are alarmists, so you are too emotional. It's democracy will survive and so on. No, I think we were not alarmists last year, and especially for him. I don't see him today though. I brought statistics, and I will not tire you more. I respect your tired guys. Just 3 issues statistically and empirically proven in recent years. So comparing 2012 to 2022, 10 years difference. 10 years ago, 46% of world population, all humanity, less than half, live in autocracies. That's the result of a long wave of democratization. However, today, it's 72%, or 5.7 billion people living in autocracies. Not in autocratizing countries, but in autocracies, electoral or full-fledged. Another statistics, but I think it wakes us up a little bit, right? If we look at the political communities that live in autocratizing states in 2012 and today, 10 years ago it was only 5% of population living in these countries. So countries that were losing political freedoms. Today, 40%. So we are in a deep shit from the point of view of democracy, and it's getting worse. And probably in the near future, we are doomed to autocracies. Well, also in support of this argument, there's a political economic argument. It's also from the same report that Nils was mentioning, VDAM report on Democracy 22. VDAM means varieties of democracy. And these guys, again, boring, empirical, good science that looks deep in what's going on around the world, in each country, in each community, gathering these 100-something indicators, working as only the Scandinavians can work. And Baltic countries as well. So, what they say? Economic role of democracies is in decline. Here we use a little bit longer difference. In 1998, share of world trade between democracies was 74%. 3/4 of economies were on democratic side. Today, 74 is between autocracies. So you see, even economy plays in favor of these guys. Okay, what it means. Are we doomed? Well, as a political philosopher who does not belong to a hegemonic school, Western school, this normative approach, I am realist or neo-realist who values what's going on. So our school we follow the shoes of Hannah Arendt, and we study what's going on. So it's phenomenological approach to politics. And what we see is that political realities are being created through our collective efforts, our creativity, political creativity. And these outcomes that we have in democratization and now in autocratization is our participation. So what we see is elections, for example, when the quality, democratic quality and liberal, so legal quality of elections in democracies are declining. And the role of elections in autocracies is growing. That's a paradox of our time. So elections are now becoming more and more important for non-democratic or anti-democratic forces. I live and vote in Italy as well. So I have experience of voting in Ukraine, organizing electoral campaigns in Eastern European countries, not only Ukraine. And then I have experience of voting in Italy. And it's so boringly honest. That was a pleasure. As idealists, I would really praise what's going on. So even very good, honest campaigning period, voting period, counting period of elections, everything is working perfectly. It's not only perfect bicameralism, it's also honest elections. And they bring La Sorella dei Fratelli d'Italia. It's something that really strikes me that even in the core European Union we have this negative effect. But if we look in Moldova, I won't bring here in Ukrainian case, Moldova, the major pro-European politician works against the constitutional order. Or we can look at Northern Africa, where European role, Europeanization, attempts to bring closer these nations to Europe, were having quite a difficult result. In Ideology and Politics journal, Jack, when you presented me, you mentioned this journal, we had a special issue. 10 years, what happened after 10 years of Arab Spring? It's a disaster. So behemoth leads to the worst kind of Leviathan. So you can see how today we live in a world where autocracy is not a challenge, it's reality. It's democracy that now is an ideal, and we have to fight for it. And to end on a positive note, on constructivist note, what should we do with this? So how to make sure that the next 30 years we will talk about the end of the wave of autocratization and the fourth wave of democratization, also on the European continent. And number one is probably that we should actually pay attention to elections. Well, in Italy, I think electoral reform is not necessary. In the United States, well, the fact is, there is no fact that this electoral system was actually producing this fraud. No, the fact is distrust of citizens to the system. And another fact is that American experts, wonderful think tanks, and I work for one of those, they propose reforms of electoral system in the United States, and it's not being done. Politicians and experts, politicians and citizens have a clear cleavage on that issue. So we have to provide and reform electoral systems to the level that peoples living under autocracies would see that actually elections can produce a positive effect. Second, democracies betray their marriage with liberalism more and more. Thanks God we have Polish case, and that's some bright ray in a very dark skies. But it's getting worse and worse in Europe, in Africa, in Eurasia. Even democratic forces, they become more and more majoritarian, nationalist oriented. And liberal component is in decline globally and in each big macro region. So we have to stop with the divorce. We have to have good family consultant that would help Democrats and liberals marry again. Third, even in stable democracies, we see that ideological monopolies are being established. That's because of the war. That's because of the global conflict that we have today. And this is amazingly how wars actually promote anti-liberal, anti-democratic agenda, but democracies participate in this mechanism. So the fourth important and the final tool is to find the new interstate, international relations system where democracies and autocracies can coexist without wars. Quite a challenge. But every war produces more autocratic outcomes than democratic. And that's an issue. So strategically, democracies should become smarter, less behemotic, less emotional, and start thinking in 30 years, 50 years perspectives, like Putin does, like Erdogan does, like Xi does. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Nous allons passer maintenant à des questions, des commentaires de la salle. Est-ce que quelqu'un voudrait faire un commentaire? Tout à fait derrière, là, je vois un monsieur avec des lunettes. Est-ce que vous auriez la gentillesse de vous présenter quand vous prenez la parole. Et est-ce que je peux demander à deux personnes de nous aider avec les micros qui sont ici?
Merci. Je m'appelle Ahmed et je viens de Tunisie. Je suis très content d'être ici. Et en vous écoutant, il m'est venu à l'esprit que lorsqu'on réfléchit à propos de l'autoritarisme et de la démocratie naissante dans nos pays, on a tendance à évoquer aussi le double standard. Tout à l'heure, professeur Frédéric, vous avez évoqué la conditionnalité. Mais en ce qui concerne la conditionnalité, on a toujours cette dichotomie entre vouloir réellement imposer la conditionnalité et demander les pays partenaires à respecter la démocratie et l'état de droit, et un certain pragmatisme, entre guillemets, qui fait que cette conditionnalité ne fonctionne pas. Et que certains leaders ou chefs de gouvernement ou chefs d'État européens, lorsqu'ils s'adressent à leur vis-à-vis au sud de la Méditerranée, notamment dans les pays dans lesquels la transition démocratique n'a pas fonctionné, ils n'ont pas l'air à vouloir réellement s'attacher à cette conditionnalité. Et même si on ne considère pas que c'est de la conditionnalité, mais on peut dire que si on ne respecte pas l'état de droit et la démocratie, alors pourquoi être partenaire? Juste par pragmatisme, par intérêt, par profit, juste par vouloir voir que la sécurité au nord prévaut par rapport à la démocratie au sud. Et c'est ce double standard qui fait qu'on n'arrive pas réellement à avancer ensemble lorsque on s'adresse à des gens et leur dire voilà, mais nous sommes démocrates, nous voulons que la démocratie s'instaure. Mais si nous sommes démocrates et nous voulons que la démocratie s'instaure, il faudrait aussi avoir le courage de ne pas faire prévaloir le profit ou l'intérêt immédiat sur l'objectif à long terme qui est la démocratie. Et donc, conditionnalité ou pas, on voit que certains gouvernements, notamment le gouvernement italien avec Meloni qui arrive en Tunisie avec son projet de vouloir avoir un accord avec le gouvernement tunisien, défendant naturellement, disons, l'intérêt italien et l'intérêt européen indirectement, sans vouloir penser à la démocratie. Et donc comment pouvons-nous avancer sur le chemin de la démocratie avec une telle attitude des gouvernements qui sont partenaires?
Merci. Est-ce que quelqu'un dans le panel voudrait réagir? Yeah, okay, we collect. Well, that wasn't really a question, it was a statement. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres commentaires ou questions? Oui, madame.
Bonjour, je suis Svetlana Stelli, la présidente d'une association strasbourgeoise qui s'appelle Women for Ukraine. Et j'ai une question tout à fait simple. Demain, nous attendons tous le rapport sur l'élargissement, mais comme nous savons tous, l'élargissement c'est un processus à double tranchant. Les pays candidats doivent s'adapter aux critères et aux valeurs européennes, mais aussi bien l'instance accueillante, si vous voulez, l'Union européenne, doit s'adapter aussi à ses futurs membres. Donc ma question est, dans l'attente de cette décision, comment croyez-vous que justement l'Union européenne devrait s'adapter, comment elle devrait adapter son cadre législatif, quelles réformes devrait-elle faire pour avoir un fonctionnement fluide et efficace, pour éviter tout soubresaut de la démocratie, tel que les arrivées des extrêmes par exemple.
Merci. Bon, on va prendre encore une question et puis après on va demander au panel. Monsieur là qui a la main levée.
Hello, my name is Herman. I'm from Eastern European School of Political Studies and from Belarus also. So we have said that autocrats, they've taken over democracy, like 70% of the countries are autocratic regime. And it seems to me that the problem is that autocrats just simply taught to use technologies, taught to use internet, mass media, for example, Telegram channels, TikTok, in their interest. They can manipulate public opinion easily, they can spread misinformation, and not all people have criticized mind, unfortunately. So maybe it's time to design strict regulations on misinformation. I guess the European Union can establish those regulations. Thank you.
Thank you. They're two quite separate questions. I think perhaps I'll ask Frédéric to answer or comment on the first question about enlargement and about the adaptations that the lady said the European Union should make for Ukraine, for instance.
Alors concernant la première question sur la conditionnalité politique, le problème que vous évoquez est un problème, j'allais dire, bien connu de la conditionnalité politique et de ses limites. Pour essayer d'avancer un peu, peut-être faudrait-il promouvoir un peu plus efficacement le principe de cohérence entre les actions internes à l'État ou à l'Union et ses actions externes. Mais ça ne résoudra pas tout. Le même problème a été évoqué d'ailleurs dans l'Union européenne, parce que quand on a soumis le Next Generation EU à la conditionnalité à l'intérieur même de l'Union européenne, la Pologne a posé la question justement du standard utilisé pour faire ce contrôle. Est-ce que ce standard doit être entre les mains des politiques? Est-ce qu'il doit être dans les mains des juges, ce qui est plutôt effectivement la solution qui a été choisie en Europe? C'est peut-être aussi une des questions à poser, c'est-à-dire que la question du double standard est aussi la question de qui vérifie la conditionnalité et à quel critères est-ce qu'on la soumet. Maintenant, moi, je n'ai pas d'autres solutions miracles que celle-là. Je pense qu'effectivement, la question qui est une question constante de la géopolitique, qui consiste à savoir si effectivement la politique extérieure doit être un moyen de finalement étendre une influence, par exemple par l'exportation de la démocratie, ou dans quelle mesure est-ce un moyen de protéger ses propres intérêts dans une vision que vous avez décrite gentiment comme étant pragmatique, mais qui est aussi la vieille question qui était celle de finalement l'établissement du Conseil de l'Europe, qui est raisonner la raison d'État. Donc il n'y a pas de solution, selon moi, qui est une solution miracle. Il y a des moments où la conditionnalité peut fonctionner. Il y a certainement des zones d'influence où la conditionnalité peut fonctionner plus facilement, mais que pour qu'il y ait de la conditionnalité politique, j'ai envie de dire qu'au-delà de la cohérence à s'imposer, il faut réussir à être deux. Et c'est pas quelque chose qu'on peut, selon moi, imposer de manière unilatérale. Concernant la question de comment l'Union doit adapter son cadre à l'adhésion, c'est normalement pas la question qu'on pose. C'est-à-dire que ce que je constate, c'est qu'on a élargi l'Union européenne sans jamais véritablement arriver à reposer la question de savoir comment réformer ces institutions qui n'ont fait que grossir au fur et à mesure de l'adhésion des États membres. L'Ukraine, là où elle pose probablement la question de manière plus frontale, c'est que si l'Ukraine entre dans les conditions actuelles, probablement qu'elle est un peu trop grosse. C'est-à-dire qu'elle le risque de déséquilibre est beaucoup plus important. sur le plan politique, sur le plan géopolitique et sur le plan d'un certain nombre de politiques de l'Union européenne, politique régionale, politique agricole, pour ne citer par exemple que quelques-unes des politiques qui peuvent interroger. D'où je pense effectivement une discussion plus franche des États sur comment est-ce qu'elle doit s'adapter si effectivement la perspective est celle de l'adhésion de l'Ukraine et à quel timing. Je ne sais pas si l'horizon 2030 est le bon horizon, mais probablement faudra-t-il cette double adaptation, qui est une adaptation à la fois, selon moi, des processus de décision, même si je suis pas, je pense pas que la fin de l'unanimité soit nécessairement la bonne solution, et une solution d'ailleurs bien efficace, mais qui repose la question probablement de l'Europe. Alors je ne sais pas si elle est en cercle concentrique, si elle est plus intensive à certains endroits, moins intensive à d'autres, etc. Mais probablement que ça se repose. Et puis la question plus de l'unanimité, c'est plus la question de savoir à quelles conditions on bloque. Et est-ce qu'on bloque de bloc à bloc? C'est l'éternel problème nord-sud, est-ouest, hein, mais qui évidemment va prendre une teinte particulière. Et puis à combien d'États ou à quel niveau de population effectivement on a une minorité de blocage. Probablement que la question est plus là que véritablement dans une espèce d'hystérisation autour de l'unanimité qui de toute façon est une partie très partielle du problème, puisque l'unanimité suppose qu'on vote dans l'Union européenne. Et ce qu'on essaye plutôt de faire, c'est pas trop voter. En tout cas entre États, pour éviter de minoriser trop radicalement un État, d'où l'importance du consensus. Après, il y a différentes manières de construire ce consensus, et c'est probablement dans ces manières-là, effectivement, qu'il faut essayer de réfléchir. Et puis les derniers éléments, c'est sur les politiques. Et là, ça nous mènerait certainement beaucoup trop loin dans la discussion, mais peut-être quand même l'une des questions à poser, c'est qu'est-ce qu'on fait avec la politique régionale? C'est une vieille question, hein, mais qui là prendra une teinte particulière étant donné l'ampleur de la reconstruction. Ça veut dire que tous les fonds de la politique régionale se déplacent un cran plus à l'est, ce qui était déjà une discussion importante, mais qui, je pense, va être une discussion importante dans la perspective de ce qui pourrait advenir à partir de demain.
Bien, merci beaucoup. Je vais demander peut-être à Niels de commenter la question sur la désinformation.
Yeah, I mean, the issue of technology and democracy, I think, is a tough one because it cuts both ways. For example, at Amnesty, we deploy digital campaigning and online human rights education in a systematic way, including in Poland running up to the elections. And we have people who do social listening, who monitor social media to understand what is working and what is not. We also take people who are interested in participating and take them on membership journeys digitally and foster their participation. So in this way, technology can be used to promote human rights and democracy. But what is very scary to me is not only authoritarian governments that are deploying technologies to suppress democracy, it's also our democracies. Amnesty has this wonderful branch called Amnesty Tech, which does investigations of surveillance, several big ones, Pegasus and Predator. And you have a number of European governments using these technologies in Poland, in Spain, in Hungary, in Greece, to spy on the political opposition, to spy on journalists, and to spy on human rights defenders. And this is quite dangerous. This subverts democracy, it subverts freedom of expression, it subverts freedom of assembly. You know, this was one of the reasons I think that initially we all thought that social media would help the Arab Spring, and then it turns out the authoritarian rulers were quite adept at using it to follow and silence critics. So it's a bit of an arms race, and the Democrats and the human rights activists have to keep up with these technological trends. But it's and disinformation. I think, to me, this is the most terrifying thing about artificial intelligence, is it will increase exponentially kind of the reach of people spreading disinformation. And we have no answers to it now. I mean, I've encountered, I think we're beginning to encounter this not only in elections but elsewhere. And and human rights standards and the law is not keeping up with these technological changes. It's quite terrifying, actually. I think we have to invest a lot of effort and time into catching up. We'll never fully catch up, but at least to adapt the legal framework to these new challenges.
Thank you. In terms of disinformation, you don't really mean artificial intelligence. The British Brexit campaign demonstrated that there are plenty of human intelligence or lack of intelligence lies very well in this report. I'm a little bit worried because it's now 21:36, and I think the interpreters will probably soon get rather annoyed because we're going on for rather longer than we had foreseen. So I think that unless, does anybody else want to make a comment here, or is there a very urgent question in the room? I see no questions from the room. I don't know if you want to make a final comment, any of you. I would just repeat what I said earlier. I think that if we want to protect democracy, if we want to stop authoritarianism, then it's the responsibility of every single one of us. And it starts by voting. For many of you here, voting, not for me unfortunately, for many of you here voting in the European elections, because if you don't vote, you're leaving the door open to the people who want to vote in order to destroy what is going on in Europe at the moment. So please just take one thing away from here, the importance of every individual taking responsibility for protecting our values and protecting democracy. Thank you very much. And, thank you very much for coming here, and hope to see you again very soon. Thank you.